I am very excited to announce the first course at the new Unregistered Academy, which you can find at patreon.com/unregistered. I will be hosting a 2-part live interactive webinar on the history of NATO with Scott Ritter. That will be May 2nd and May 9th. Those are Mondays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, you can buy this course in 2 ways. It is free for members of the Unregistered Academy at patreon.com/unregistered, and it is also available for purchase at thaddeusrussell.com/NATO. I hope to see you in class. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. I absolutely love appearing on the Blackbird podcast with James Jenneman. As you'll see, we talk about a great number of topics, from the war in Ukraine to the grooming hysteria on the religious right. But throughout, I have a blast, and I hope you do too, watching it or listening to it. This is my interview on the Blackbird podcast with James Jenneman.
Hello, audience. Welcome to Blackbird, episode number 91. My name is James, and today I am joined once again by Thad Russell. Thad, thanks for joining me again.
Always, my friend. Always and anytime. Love this. Let's go.
Really? All right, cool. I'll see you in a week. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I've got Mark Chang-Yeezy coming on next week, who I think he was mentioned on... No, he was mentioned on Tom's show, not yours. But yeah, he's been really great on COVID. You'd probably like to interview him.
Okay.
If you want to keep dwelling on COVID. But anyway, I wanted to talk to you. So you're like number 4 in my 4-part series on Renegade University, which I'd love to know what the hell happened there. So yeah. Do you? I mean, unless you want to redo your bio, which I think pretty much everybody watching has some familiarity with who you are, so we can probably just jump into it.
Yeah. No, actually, this is great. Perfect timing. I can now announce finally that I am formally separating from Renegade University. I will no longer be a member of that company. I will no longer be producing any content for RU. I will no longer have anything to do with RU. So I'm now fully on Patreon, and everyone should go to patreon.com/unregistered, where we have bonus episodes of the show. You get access to my shows on Thursday nights. And now we are about to start teaching courses on Patreon. So probably through a subscription model, you'll be able to take all of my courses there, which will be a great deal for everyone. And a new age has begun.
Yeah, nice. So are you still going to be kind of shipping in instructors and stuff like that, or is it going to be you teaching primarily?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I just signed up Scott Ritter to teach a course on the history of NATO.
Oh, nice. Cool.
Yeah.
He's the one he was on your show recently, right?
Yeah, he's huge right now.
What's his kind of claim to fame?
Well, he was the guy who exposed the lie of WMDs in Iraq. He was the weapons inspector in the 90s and early 2000s who became infamous in the foreign policy establishment for repeatedly saying that Saddam did not, in fact, have weapons of mass destruction, and he was pilloried by none other than Joe Biden. Everyone should go look at a video of Joe Biden just insulting Scott Ritter in a congressional hearing. Just Google Joe Biden, Scott Ritter. You'll see that come up. It's pretty remarkable how arrogant Joe Biden was. I mean, this was about WMDs, and he was making fun of Scott Ritter for saying that the weapons did not exist. And now, of course, we know what the deal is, and yet another feather in the cap for Joe Biden's illustrious career. He's pretty much done nothing right in 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, he has been there for longer than I've been alive, and literally every move, every step of the way, he's been on the wrong side of everything.
You can't. I don't.
How does?
I don't think there's a worse politician in my lifetime.
How does someone like that continue climbing the ladder? I mean, how the hell did that guy become president?
He's a great glad-hander, and he's just a professional politician. And he built a little fiefdom in Delaware, which also has a, I imagine is controlling Delaware is not as hard as controlling a state like California. But it's still difficult. I don't know exactly how he did it, but I mean, he just basically worked machine politics in the 70s. And by the time the 80s rolled around, and I was actually on Capitol Hill in 1988, and I saw Joe Biden walking around.
Oh, really?
Doing his thing. I was an intern for the Associated Press, and it gave me access to. I got inside all the rooms in the Capitol building. That was where I worked, was the Capitol building, and so I was taking elevators with all these fuckers, and and Biden was just. I remember watching him conduct this little meeting with a bunch of reporters, and I just remember thinking, God, this guy's a real operator. Like he's really trying to move things. He's really a hustler. He's a hustler. And I think that's it. I think hard work pays off. He's obviously never been the brightest of the Congress people. And then also what's amazing is that in terms of policy, and this is what I don't understand, and I guess this is your question, he has consistently voted against the interests of the left. Consistently. The stated interests of the left. There's not, I don't think, one major issue on which Joe Biden didn't essentially take the side of right-wingers in the Republican Party. Or just fascism, like the crime bill of 1994, which was supported by the Republicans, but it was mostly supported by the Congressional Black Caucus. So yeah, it's remarkable, and he was the main cheerleader for the Iraq War in 2003 as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and it just one after the other, and of course, as president, it's just, as we all know, it's been just a rolling catastrophe since last January. Yeah.
Has he always been as good at virtue signaling as, I mean, I guess he's not good at it, but has he always virtue signaled the way he does now?
Well, he's a chameleon. So in the 90s, he was virtue signaling by calling for law and order. That was the big thing in the 90s. The Clintons, people forget this. The Clintons were also very much behind the crime bill and the lock 'em up mantra of the 90s. And so he was riding that wave. That's when it was virtuous at that time to be for mass incarceration. So that's why he gave lots of speeches on the Senate floor talking about how great his bill was in that it was going to lock up people for life. Nonviolent drug offenders. By the way,
I don't remember it. I was little, but I've seen it.
Yeah, and by the way, I right now have two very good friends who are going to prison for nonviolent drug offenses. One for cannabis and one for ecstasy. And they're both facing multiple. One is everyone knows Dan Music is going to prison for 5 years on May 11th for cannabis distribution, no violence whatsoever in his record. And then I have another friend, one of my best friends here, is probably going to prison for distribution of ecstasy, also nonviolent. So these things are really personal for me now.
Is that the result of the still in force Biden crime bill?
I'm sorry. Yes, those were entirely because of Joe Biden's mandatory minimum sentences for drug dealing. Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Mandatory minimums. Why do you think progressives love mandatory minimums so much? Is it for the same reason that they love trains so much? They just like to have a standardized thing?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it's because, it's standardization and centralization, and they don't like individuals to have discretion, even judges, right? They don't want any individual to have discretion. They're interested in systems and the collective and managing large masses of people. And so centralization and standardization is necessary, for any, and especially in a country this size. If you want to centralize and standardize anything in a country of 350 million, super diverse people, you're going to have to standardize and centralize nonstop. This is why the neocons and the progressive liberals have always been on the same side on this. This is why they both supported No Child Left Behind, the centralization of the curricula in all the schools. Yeah, it's a big deal. And people kind of they underestimate it. I mean, conservatives understand this. They call this out. They know what's going on here. But the big sort of liberal mass of Americans don't get it. They think it's all good for the federal government to maintain or extend its power.
All right. Well, let's. So this is week 4 of RU month. So I do want to get into some of your work as an instructor at RU, even if it's going to be transitioning over to your unregistered Patreon,
yep.
which is great. I'm a member of your Patreon, by the way. I can totally vouch for it.
Thank you.
So I guess I just want to start. How do you describe the job of a historian? Like, what is it? What's primarily a historian supposed to do?
We are supposed to explain, or I should say, we are supposed to describe and explain, if we're good, explain change over time. So historians, professional historians, almost universally believe that nothing is static and everything is historical, meaning that everything is historically contingent. So in a sense, every professional historian is a postmodernist in that way. We are trained. Yeah. I mean, even the very like mainstream liberal historians and conservatives ones all look down on what's called transhistoricism, meaning the belief in transhistorical phenomena, things that travel through history independent of human consciousness, right? Things that act like a god or act like nature. So the people on the left, they tend to be transhistorical about racism. That's their big one, right? They believe that racism is this independent entity that floats above us and floats all around us. It doesn't matter whether we live or die or what we say or do. There will always be this racism in American culture and in the minds of white people, right? That's this transhistorical idea. That's obviously nonsense. Race and ideas about race and racism come and go. They ebb and flow. They change constantly. And so that's the kind of thing that historians really go after. We don't like any claims of anything being static or transhistorical like that. So our job is always to find why change is happening, to show how it's happening, and to then explain why it's happening.
So what about the kind of, I mean, it's really popular right now, especially on the right, the idea that history is kind of cyclical, like the fourth turning narrative, for instance. Do you reject the idea that just cultural forces are kind of inevitable, or is it more that you kind of ignore the fact that that's going on because you're more looking at the details rather than the big picture?
I mean, I think that everything is cultural. So I'm a Hegelian in that sense. I believe that ideas and culture are what make history. I think that ideas and culture are what make laws. Andrew Breitbart's famous formulation of law and politics being downstream from culture, I think, is correct, completely right. So no, I'm a cultural historian primarily, although that means that I talk about things like NATO and the Federal Reserve. I just do it through a cultural lens, right? So things like NATO and the Federal Reserve, people think, what does that have to do with cultural politics? It has everything to do with cultural politics. Those things wouldn't exist if there wasn't a broad culture supporting their existence. So most Americans are unaware of those things existing or know very little about it. So they give it their tacit consent. There's no opposition to NATO and the Federal Reserve. And then all the insiders, the experts, those who have created the Federal Reserve and NATO, they're, of course, they're big supporters. And so it's the ideas, it's the culture of those institutions, the culture that supports those institutions that make them possible and that keep them alive. So to end NATO, if we want to end NATO, which is everyone's talking about NATO these days, you have to change people's mind about it. It's about changing ordinary Americans' minds. Like, let them know what Article 5 says. Let them know that if Estonia is attacked by Russia, we are contractually obligated to attack Russia and get into World War III. People, the vast majority of Americans have no clue about that. And so that's just, we've got to let them know and then say, hey, do you want that arrangement? Do you want it to be that way? Do you want us to be on the hook for anything that happens to Estonia? Do you want to go to World War III if the Baltic states are attacked And that's when you change. And then once you get people changing their minds about these things, law changes in response to it. That seems very obvious to me. Even in an autocracy that happens. In Putin's Russia, if most Russians decide that they don't like Putin and they don't like the war in Ukraine, Putin's gone. It's just that he happens to be very popular. And so it's that culture that creates everything legal and political.
So what about though, like the constructions that, it's this view that like there's these certain archetypes that sort of shape the culture, which then shapes the politics. So like, the tribal chieftain wins a war, and so this warrior is now the shaper of culture, but he's dumb, so his advisors eventually become the shapers of culture. But advisors don't make money. They're typically a priestly caste in, historical or traditional societies. So they need money men. So then eventually the money men supplant the advisors or the priests as the manufacturers of culture, and then it just keeps going and going and going like that. There's also a fourth one, and I don't remember what it is, but I think you get the point. Is that sort of meta narrative frowned upon by all historians, most historians, just you, or do you even frown on it?
The meta narrative that the money people end up determining culture, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, so they do, but then eventually they get supplanted by the yeoman caste, basically the people living in poverty, until those yeomen have a new tribal chieftain who wins a war on their behalf, and so he gets in charge, and then it just keeps repeating over and over again. His advisors take charge, and then their funders take charge, and then the funders get too big for their britches, and the poor people replace the yeomen as the shapers of culture.
I think this is what you're getting at. So how much did CNN just spend on CNN Plus? How much
$300 million.
$300 million? $300 million, yeah. And it folded in 5 weeks. Is that right?
Yeah.
5 weeks. Okay, so one of the most powerful, arguably the most powerful corporation on earth, you could argue that CNN is more powerful than Google because CNN controls the minds of half the population. Certainly one of the most powerful, right? With all of the marketing power you could ever ask for. Can you imagine owning CNN and wanting to market a product? Holy Christ. I mean, you have the most powerful marketing vehicle in history, and yet it failed completely. The wealthiest people, Jeff Zucker and the board of CNN, whatever it is, right? We're talking about the wealthiest, most powerful people on earth, and they could not convince Americans to watch their stupid product. That tells me that the money people don't really determine culture. That it actually comes from the bottom.
Well, I have a feeling though that we're at the end of that particular phase in the cycle. Like Jeff Tucker on your show, on one of the seminars that you republished, he called it a pre-paradigmatic post-pandemic era or whatever. Basically that we're in this kind of liminal space where we're moving from one era to another, and so the moneyed people are kind of losing their power, and now the next kind of natural part in that cycle is that the I don't know, the proletariat, I guess, are going to be the ones who are now shaping culture.
That's right. The proletariat have risen, and you know how they've risen? They've risen through Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. So when Citizens United happened, of course, everybody on the left was saying, "Oh gosh, this means that only wealthy people will be able to run for president. Only independently wealthy people, only people with big donors. The big donors will be able to run for president. Only those with corporate backing will be president." Right? Exactly the opposite happened. Trump, he didn't get any corporate backing. Wall Street shunned him. Bernie got no corporate backing. His campaign was financed entirely from the grassroots by people giving $5 or $10 or $20. And those are the two most powerful and ascendant politicians in America. So, again, money, doesn't guarantee success, and it certainly doesn't necessarily determine culture. You have to give the people what they want. And once you give them what they want, if you keep giving them what they want, they will be loyal to you like they are with CNN. But if you veer from giving them what they want, they will reject you and dump you almost immediately. Consumers are notoriously fickle, and this is a good thing. It keeps capitalists and those in power on their toes. It's called consumer sovereignty, this concept of consumers holding all the power.
That seems kind of capitalist.
It is.
I texted you a while back and asked if you described yourself as a revisionist historian, and you said all historians are revisionists. If they're not, they're just chroniclers. What do you think? Tell me about the term revisionist history. What does it mean?
It just means it's a history that revises the existing history. just a revision of the existing history. So if you make any changes to the existing narrative, then you are revisionist. So again, like unless you are simply copying the arguments of previous historians, which some people do, everyone's a revisionist. Now, it just depends on how revisionist you want to be, and I tend to be more revisionist than most. And you might call me a radical revisionist because I'm revising not just the details of the American narrative, but I'm revising really I'm attempting to revise just the way we think about it, the very framework with which we view it. So I'm basically viewing American history and politics generally through a sort of Freudian lens, of the battle between civilization and its discontents, those who seek to maintain the moral order on the one hand, and on the other hand, the renegades, the people who are breaking the moral order, violating norms. And that includes all sorts of people, from prostitutes in the 19th century to Donald Trump today. That's a constant battle that's been going on since the founding of the country. And so I just look at it through that, and I see a whole different narrative. I see a whole different dynamic, a different tension in American history, this long cultural civil war that I think has been central always and has determined things in politics, things in the law, it's things in the media. That battle between the moral guardians of order and the renegades, once I started to look at it that way, people saw American history and politics generally very different. So that's a radical revision of the traditional narrative.
What kind of, what emotions do you experience when you think of the historical renegades? And does that differ from the emotions that you feel when you think about like Donald Trump or a more modern day renegade?
No, Trump is pretty good. I mean, he's a good renegade for the most part. He's violating a bunch of norms and he's doing so without any shame. That's really the definition of the people that I'm talking about in my book. It's when they do it shamelessly, and sort of effortlessly. They do it just in the way that they live their lives day to day. Those are the most powerful and radical and dangerous people in any society. Those who just get up and do something they're not supposed to do. And whether it's tweeting intemperate things as Trump did, or it's selling sex if you're a woman, in the 19th century, or it's selling liquor in the 1920s. Those are all renegade actions because they are uninterested in the norms, in the rules, in the codes of conduct, right? That's what makes people crazy about Trump, is that he doesn't care that he's breaking the rules, that he's breaking the norms. Same with the horrors of the 19th century. They didn't care. They flaunted it. They flaunted what they were doing.
Do you think Elon Musk falls in that category, or is he like a limited hangout?
To some extent. I mean, again, these guys are also interested in improving the establishment. I'm never interested in improving the establishment. I'm interested in forcing the establishment to improve itself through competition and rebellion. But yeah, so I mean, they're interested in sort of taking over the establishment. Obviously, Trump is, and so is Elon Musk to some extent. But they're radical revisionists of the establishment too. So I am mostly on their side when it comes to their battles with the existing order.
Do you think that the ruling class or the establishment, well, first of all, are the establishment and the ruling class the same thing?
Great question. Yeah, this is like, I'm sort of betraying my leftist history here. This is the way leftists think about it. Is there a thing called the ruling class? Although I've heard a lot of libertarians and paleocons also use that term. Yeah, there's a ruling class. Yeah. I mean, it's not like there's a formal membership, and it's not like you can identify precisely who belongs to it. But, sure. I would say that people who are certainly in politics, I would say that major capitalists, the big capitalists, those who are active politically instead of just making money and going home at night, but the ones like Gates and Buffett, et cetera, who are injecting their ideas into the public sphere. I would say that the heads of the think tanks in Washington, D.C. are very much a part of the ruling class. I mean, every war has pretty much been authorized and dreamed up by the Council on Foreign Relations in some way or another, and other think tanks, right? I mean, World War II would have been very different without the Council on Foreign Relations. And the post-war world would have been very different without the Council on Foreign Relations. They literally sat and secretly planned for the post-war order beginning in 1939. And when the war was won by the United States, they could implement their plan for the world on behalf of the United States and the State Department. They worked directly with the State Department. So it was the thinkers, it was ideas and thinkers. They're a bunch of intellectuals, right? Sitting and looking at maps of the world. They determined history. Their ideas determined history. So yeah, the ruling class, as Gramsci said, so Gramsci, says that the ruling class is the class that controls the culture, that has cultural hegemony. And so look to see who has cultural hegemony, and that's pretty clear. It is the educated liberal elite who come from also, I would say, those who run the universities, the major universities. That is very much the ruling class. Oh, here's the easiest thing to look at. Who runs the schools? Whoever runs the schools in any society, that's the ruling class. Would anyone disagree with me on that? Right? The people who teach the children, that's the ruling class. So we know who that is. That's teachers' unions, and it's politicians, and it's mostly the Democratic Party.
Almost exclusively. So what do you think about Ron DeSantis's pushback against the sort of woke school stuff down in Florida? To me, I don't necessarily think there was any problem to begin with. Like, I think that they're fighting against a paper tiger, or whatever it is,
a phantom,
a scarecrow.
Phantom.
Yeah. Thank you. There you go. But on the other hand, I mean, it sure is good optics for pushing back against what we have just decided is the ruling class. Do you have an opinion on that? And I should say also, as someone who is very very sympathetic towards sort of the LGBTQ, trans, etc. Maybe not the movement, but it itself, like queerness itself. Like you I think have even described yourself as queer.
Yeah, not anymore because it's been so misused. But I mean, I will say this: many of my ideas are consistent and are inspired by queer theory of the 1980s and 90s. So that's true. But I would no longer call myself queer because that puts me in a very bad category these days, since so many terrible people are calling themselves queer. And I see a lot of very, very straight people who don't even have unusual ideas calling themselves queer now. So I'm not going to do that anymore. Yeah. But so queer politics and queer theory, which came out of the 70s and 80s, they came out of the Stonewall Rebellion, they came out of gay liberation of the 1970s. That was one of the most liberationist movements and phenomena in American history, bar none. And I challenge anybody who's interested in personal freedom to challenge me on that. I challenge anyone to challenge me. I challenge anyone to dispute that. We're talking about people who were kept in a closet, people who were locked up in prisons, people who were routinely rounded up by cops and paraded, before City Hall and had their names and pictures put in newspapers just for being gay, just for their sexual preference. And they were having, this was consenting, of course, sex. And they fought the cops in the street, and they won, and they scared all the city councils in the country to stop this practice of locking up homosexuals. And it ushered in this wonderful era of the 1970s of major sexual liberation, which affected all of us, not just gays and lesbians. Many of us, most of us, I think, benefited from that. We had an opening of the sexual culture of this country. We had an opening of what it meant to be a man or a woman. And people just experienced freedom for the first time in that way. And I think that is a profound effect on American culture and on my own life, and I think on the lives of almost all of us. So that was queer, and queer theory came out and said, hey, you know what? These categories of man and woman, they have changed over time. There's nothing determining them. Your genitals don't say, like, whether or not you're going to like football. It doesn't determine whether or not you like football, whether you have a penis or not, right? And they said, so you're not, your dick, they said, is not your destiny. Your genitals do not determine your destiny. That is not, you can actually make choices in another direction. You can have a penis and like ballet. You can have a vagina and like football. And of course, there have been many people on both sides who have done just those things over the years. So they said, instead, they said, we are free to choose our identification. Other people don't have to abide by that. Other people don't have to agree that we are what we say we are. The original queer theorists and the queer activists of the 70s and 80s said simply, we are for freedom from the constraints of dominant traditional gender roles. That all got perverted in the 1990s, and especially in the last 20 years, by these assholes on college campuses who took that idea and then made it just the opposite. They started to say, my identity, that I was born with it, and I can't do anything with it, and your identity is the same. You were born with that identity, and it's going to determine your destiny. It means that you are a sexist and a misogynist and a transphobe and whatever it is they want to say, because you were born in that body, James Gentleman. So it's the exact reversal of what the queer theorists had been saying before, which is that your body, your biology is not what determines who you become as a person. all these trans activists, most of them I would say, and most of these race activists say just the opposite, right? They say if you're black, that means this about your life, and if you're white, it means that about your life. It's essentialist, and it is totalitarian, and it's authoritarian.
So critical theory is almost the antithesis to queer theory. Is that right? I mean,
well, so again, original critical race theory, I think actually has some pretty valid insights in that it just sees in the law where race is not explicit. It sees some racial consequences and racial assumptions in many laws, and that's just true. You know, that's a really brilliant
I agree with
insight.
that.
That's true. Yeah.
But
Right.
the essentialist sort of critical theory kind of writ large, what James Lindsay talks about, that's less about the legal theory of critical race theory, which I might even be unfortunately named at this point. And gets into what you were just talking about, or am I wrong?
Okay,
so I haven't read the critical.
Yeah, again,
theories,
this is like this is another later perversion of an original theory that I think is actually good. So critical race theory, as far as I know, Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell, they might have, but I don't think they said anything like white people will always be racist and white people are born racist, which is the number one objection that people have had to critical race theory, is that teaching. Now, that is totally what's being taught in the schools. I've seen the evidence myself that children are totally being taught to believe essentialism, that if they're born white, they're racist, and if they're born black, they're victims. That is totally being taught. I don't think that was being taught by the original critical race theorists, though, like Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell. Okay. And in fact, I'm going to do a course with Sam Hoadley-Brill on critical race theory soon to clear this up. So,
great. Yeah, I like him. No, he was in some of the other classes that you've been part of before, right? Like as a student.
He actually works for Kimberly Crenshaw. So he knows that that cool. crowd, and I'm not a fan of Crenshaw, but so it's going to be a nice debate. But I think the critics are wrong about that particular part of it. Yeah.
So what is it that got injected into queer theory, critical theory, et cetera, that morphed it into this then?
A desire for power,
or is that something that we're going to learn?
A desire for power and a desire to hurt others. So sadism and power grabbing. A lot of it's just simple sadism. If you are, if you're like a 19 or 20-year-old kid at a college and you got nothing else going on, you got no power, except that you are at a college, but you're trained to believe that you now have been given access to this secret knowledge about truth, that the world is full of racists, then you can become virtuous immediately by calling other people racist. So it's
So
that's the motivation. Yeah, but it really appeals to people who like to hurt others, right? I mean, why else would you want to call someone a racist if it's not true? I mean, except to hurt them. And I know that's true. I mean, I know that's true with the current grooming hysteria on the right. It's a lot of sadism. They know damn well that these people are not pedophiles who they're talking about. They know goddamn well, but they do it. They say it anyway. Because they just want to hurt people. Yeah.
Huh. So that reads like religion to me. Secret knowledge, scapegoats, and the problem I see with that movement also is that there's no room for redemption. Either on the left or the right. Maybe that gets us into a little bit the tweet that you put out the other day about the religious right that you see rising up. What is that you're seeing?
Oh, well, the libs of TikTok we found out that it's run by a woman who's an Orthodox Jew. And I think that I know that a whole lot of the libs of TikTok followers are religious. That's one major example. I think the rise of this sort of popularity of Eastern Orthodox religions, Orthodox Christianity, I have many friends who have converted to that just in the last year. And that's not in itself a bad thing at all. In fact, I like a lot of that. I had Alexander Dugan on my show, and I respect a whole lot of what Dugan stands for, and I respect a lot of what people are doing there. So, you and I think Buck both came back at me and said, actually, the religious right just wants to be left alone. And I think you're totally right about some people like Dugan and some people like Buck and some people who have adopted Orthodox Christianity. But clearly,
and orthodoxy. Just real quick,
yeah,
orthodoxy stands out among other Christian like brands in that it really does. Like it's a very isolationist.
Clearly,
not quite like the Amish or whatever, but it is. I mean, there's a reason that there's so few Orthodox when there's so many Catholics. Those two religions are the same age in history. Sure. But one of them turned political and one of them didn't. So,
right.
But yeah, sorry, I interrupted you. Keep going.
No, that's a good point. And that's right. I mean, as I understand, I don't know Orthodox Christianity that well, but what I do know about it is it comports with what you're saying about it. I mean, they physically isolate themselves famously, right? And they're not imperialists. They're not even evangelical imperialists the way that most other Christians are. So yeah, I mean, if the religious right is that, then I have no problem. I'm happy. I'm very happy. But we know that there's a lot on the religious right who essentially form lynch mobs online, just like the left does whenever they smell a racist or they think they smell a racist. And and I recently experienced that, so I know this. I mean, many people threatened death to me in the name of Jesus.
Wow.
Of course, yeah. I mean, they were good Christians in their profiles. They said that they were Christians in their profiles, and they're calling to put me in a wood chipper for simply calling into question the age of consent laws, which have locked up 100 million people, mostly unjustly. So, yeah, it's a really bad phenomenon, and it's really ugly because it's the worst thing in our society to be a pedophile. It's the worst thing. So to throw that around, it's worse than calling someone a murderer. It's really, really vicious and violent.
Yeah, it is, absolutely.
Unless it's been proven that you are a pedophile, unless it's proven that you have attacked a child, it's the worst thing. But they're throwing it around against everyone, and it's nuts. I mean,
right?
These liberals in the establishment, who run the teachers' unions and Disney and all that stuff. I hate these people. Believe me, I'm the one who's been leading the fight against them for years and years and years.
Yeah.
But they are not trying to fuck your kids. That's the one thing they're not doing. I don't think. I mean, they're grooming. Children. They're grooming children politically, right? Of course, they're grooming children politically. They're indoctrinating children, of course, absolutely. And pitchforks and what's the other? Oh, torches for that. But they're not trying to fuck kids. And that's where this horrible conflation with what they're doing and pedophilia goes on. It's just it's disgusting. It's disgusting and juvenile.
That's the thing. It's almost like the people who are in power love to distract us. Like that's one of their MOs anyway. It feels like this is yet another distraction. I mean, yes, like you said, they are grooming them. They're just not grooming them for sex.
Yes.
They're grooming them for their ideological reasons. And I don't know. In a lot of ways, that's even more dangerous because it's so insidious. I mean, a kid can tell on a teacher who touches them. The kid who is just being brainwashed there's nothing to tell on.
Well, on a social level, it's of course much more insidious because that's control of the whole society. You control children's minds, you control society at large, and you can do anything. Yeah, and individual acts of pedophilia will be horrible for that child, but they will not necessarily affect politics or the culture at large. But controlling the schools, and this is where the libs of TikTok are right. They are correct that these people do control the schools, and therefore they control a lot of what our children think. And they need to be attacked for that. It's just not for this particular thing. And I also don't think they're trying to make kids trans either. That's the other claim that's being made. I mean, maybe a few, but that's not really what's going on. Kids are being taught to be trans by the culture, not by their teachers.
You think? My big problem with it is that the student-teacher relationship has become too much of a peer relationship, in my opinion. Like, I mean, when I was a kid, like our teachers would have a picture of their spouse on their desk, but it wasn't like part of their teaching that they would tell us about their family lives.
Right.
And that's what most of these teachers are whining about when they whine about what they're not allowed to say in their classrooms. Do you see that as problematic or?
Yeah. So, I mean, the DeSantis bill in Florida, banning discussion of sex and gender for, what is it, under third grade and under. I mean, I want to ban discussion. I want to ban all discussions of everything by public school teachers. I want to ban public schools. I mean, this is like, I would say that's a good start. It's a good start. I don't want them to say anything to my child. I mean, my child and I were both subjected to that shit for 13 years, each of us. So, no, it's an outrage. It's an abomination that these mediocrities with political agendas have us trapped in a classroom all day long and can say anything they want to us all day long. Ban that. Ban the whole thing, and then choose your own schools where the teachers say what you want them to say to your children. That's the obvious answer. We have to create new institutions or find new institutions.
So that brings me back to the question that I was going to ask you when I asked you to differentiate between the ruling class and the establishment. Do you think that the establishment or the ruling class is redeemable or changeable? Is it possible for the Elon Musk project to succeed, or does it just need to be scrapped?
Oh, sure. I mean, ruling classes can change constantly. They have to survive, right? Mm. Will they ever become uninterested in power? No. Will they ever become uninterested in maintaining or extending their power? No. These are people who were their whole lives they've wanted to control and manage other people. I don't think that's going to change. Only a few of us are like that, but those people belong to the ruling class, right? They become the politicians, those who want to manage the world. So no, but I mean, it's all about leverage, competition, and pressure. So, and cultural change, most importantly. So again, if there is broad agreement, vigorous support for free speech in the United States culturally, not just legally, then yes, Twitter will be like Elon Musk. The problem is the vast majority of liberals and half conservatives want censorship. Like most Americans want censorship, for sure. They're all for that, right? They just disagree on what should be censored. But so that's, again, law and policy and the conduct of corporations is downstream from culture. So we've got to change the minds of Americans about freedom of speech, and that's a very big project that has been abandoned for decades now. The ACLU no longer is for freedom of speech. Liberals no longer talk about freedom of speech. They used to be the best at that. They used to be where liberals were the best was in their defense of freedom of speech. Yeah, they no longer talk about it. So I'm pretty despairing about the future of freedom of speech. I think Brandenburg, the great Supreme Court decision, which I think is a fantastic freedom of speech regime. It makes all speech legal in this country except for the direct incitement of violence. I can publicly say anything except people should go get a gun and kill James Gentleman. And I think that's pretty damn good.
Is that the Fire in a Crowded Theater?
No, this is the revision of the Fire in a Crowded Theater. This is the Brandenburg decision.
Tell me about that case. I don't know about it.
Well, Brandenburg was, I think it was a Nazi or Ku Klux Klan, one of those cases. Some fascist was appealing was trying to, I think, have a rally or give a speech, and he was barred from doing that by the municipality. I believe this is the case. It doesn't matter. The point is the Supreme Court did rule that his speech was legal and was protected by the First Amendment. And they said very clearly and have said in many decisions that, yes, all speech is protected by the First Amendment except the direct incitement of violence, which I think is as good as you could possibly get from a government. I'm very happy with that legal regime. That's one of my favorite things about the Supreme Court. I think it's one of their best decisions ever, and it's wonderful. Now, I don't see how long that's going to last, though, because the culture, both on the left and the right, doesn't like it. They don't like that regime. They want more restrictions, more censorship.
Why? What kind of person, what kind of American who grew up in America, was educated in America, where do you think the tide shifted to that sort of idea that free speech is no longer just sort of an inherent part of what it means to be an American? It
depends on one's view of imminent threat. So if you believe that we are threatened imminently by something terrible in politics, like a Hitler or some authoritarian movement, I'm sympathetic. I understand it. I'm not saying I would do this, but I'm very sympathetic. If you and I were in Germany in 1932, 33, we might have been sympathetic to silencing Hitler, knowing what we know now, right? Maybe not, but I at least understand it. If you're a Jew in Germany in 1932, and you want to censor Hitler, I get it. I don't think it would have helped them. I think it probably would have backfired and made his rise even faster and maybe even more violent. Yeah. But nonetheless, I get the impulse. So that's where it comes from. It comes from a feeling of vulnerability, right? That's when you want to stop people from talking, is when you feel vulnerable and weak and threatened. And so people on the left, they felt genuinely threatened by Donald Trump, the new Hitler. He was a fascist and Klans leader and a racist and all the rest, and he was going to lock everybody up. And they really believed that. And so they had to censor his speech. On the right, you know, it's similar. They want to censor Disney. They want to censor teachers. They want to censor people talking about sex in any way. And, you know, Josh Hawley has 2 bills in Congress banning pornography, all of it, all pornography. You know, he's a rising star in the MAGA movement. So, you know, all sex they want to censor essentially on the right. And so if we get both of their ways, we'll have nothing to do in this country. Nothing to say or do.
Do you think that porn is too easily accessible?
Yeah. I do worry about it a little bit, I have to say. I mean, I'm of course like all for freedom of everything, but like I worry. And again, I think it's cultural. I think once younger people find out how good real sex is, I think they'll change their minds and behave differently and probably seek real sex more than porn. But I'm worried about the sexual interest and desire of especially those people under 30 who've had Pornhub at their fingertips since they were born. And I don't know. I've heard reports that it's changing the way people behave in the bedroom, and I've heard reports about how it's the decline in sex. I mean, the decline in sex among young people is terrifying and terrible and very depressing, and porn has something to do with that. I don't know if it's all of it, but yeah, it's not a great mix. But I think the answer is not in changing porn or in banning porn. The answer is in, again, liberating people to do what they want to do sexually, as long as it's consensual. So
do you think that there's a big plot? Like, I mean, COVID is an extreme example, but I mean, this is a less extreme example. A big plot to diminish the role of interpersonal relationships in society, or is it just the natural result of social media?
Damn. I don't think it was a plot, except possibly in the minds of some tech gurus in San Francisco might have thought this. No, I think, again, I think tech was giving people what they wanted. People do want privacy. They want to be able to sit in their house all by themselves and shout out at the world, you know, in anonymity. I mean, how awesome is that? You get to make fun of, you get to attack famous people, important people, powerful people, and they don't even know your name. They don't even know who you are. And you can do it from your bedroom, right? You can do it from anywhere in your house. That's an awesome thing. And it just gets very seductive and it's very fun, and people get stuck doing it, you know. But again, is that a bad thing if they're doing what they want to do? I mean, I have lots of friends who seem to just do nothing but tweet all day. I won't name anybody, but there have been many people on my podcast, you know, good friends of mine who have regular jobs. They're like professors or journalists, but they'll tweet like 100 or 200 times a day. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how that works, but you know, that's what they're into.
I'm in these Mises Caucus and other like Discord chats, and I have just during the day, I mean, it's just hundreds and hundreds of chats, like a minute, just keeps going and going and going. And I don't understand what these guys are doing. Mostly guys. There's some girls.
The
contrary to popular belief, there are female Mises Caucus people. But yeah, group chats. I can't follow them.
I know this whole phenomenon of group chats. I know, again, people under 40 seem to be doing this a lot. And I didn't know about this until recently, and it takes an enormous amount of time. And an enormous amount of time. I don't understand how things are getting done in this society, at least by our class of people. Maybe nothing is getting done. Maybe all we're doing is tweeting and texting. I don't know.
Well, so I recently, just to get a little bit personal, I guess, I recently gave up porn because it really was encroaching in my life. And that's, you know, it became almost compulsive for me. But now it's kind of like, and so I was even in my day job, I was like not performing adequately at all. But that has kind of been replaced by Discord now. Like every time I want to take a break from work, I open up Discord, and like there I am for an hour, and it just goes like it just flies by. You don't even know that it's an hour. It might even be two. Wow. I have no idea. It's not like I've got a stopwatch on. So yeah, I mean, these things are all, I mean, they just kind of suck our attention. And you know, I mean, I like the idea of being productive. I don't, like you and heavily influenced by you, I don't see the inherent value in work, but I do kind of see the inherent value in feeling satisfied with something that I've produced. And so, and hell, maybe that has something to do with the decline in self-esteem as well. Like, I mean, we don't feel productive. We don't feel like we've got the satisfaction of having produced something, which I think having produced something is what people like the Puritan work ethic means when it says the value of a hard day's work or whatever. At least if it's not corrupted by just valorizing work for no reason, for work's sake. Right. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? I just completely brain vomited.
Yeah. No. I mean, my first thought is I've been thinking a lot about Gen X, my generation, and when DMX died, when DMX was, one of the top rappers of Gen X, I was watching. I was, of course, I've been a DMX fan forever, but I sort of went back and watched a lot of his videos and listened to a lot of his songs. And before he died, I mean, even though I was a huge fan, I thought of DMX as sort of a knucklehead, essentially. Like he wrote really good beats and had some good verses, but like generally I thought he was just like a big masculine, like woo woo kind of rapper who wasn't really saying anything or doing much. And it's not true at all. Like, he worked his fucking ass off, DMX did. And if you listen to his lyrics, it's like he's telling stories with subplots, and he's rhyming constantly. So he's just working all the way through his songs really hard, and he's rapping fast, and he's rapping loud, and he's rapping clearly. That's really hard work, and he was incredibly prolific. He put out album after album and hit after hit, and he toured, and he was a hard fucking worker. And rappers today, in their teens and 20s, I mean, this is what they're known for. This is they mumble, right? And they don't speak clearly, and it's literally
called mumble rap.
They rap slowly, and also they use the same fucking beats. Talk about laziness. They use the same beats for every song, which I think is just an abomination.
So, and you're not just an old man yelling in a cloud. Like, I mean, this is real. The decline in media quality. I mean, you just have to listen to the Perfume Nationalist. I mean, everybody like is required to join Jack's Patreon and listen to every episode of the Perfume Nationalist to hear all about this. I mean, the decline in media quality is real. It's tangible. You can feel it. There's a reason that like music today sounds pretty much identical to music 15 years ago. That's not normal. Like the genres morph. They tend to evolve, and that's not happening right now. Right.
I mean, so you can go through the history. 1950s, rock and roll was born. 1960s, rhythm and blues and soul music were born. 1970s, disco was born. People can laugh at that, but disco was the basis for hip hop. 1970s and 80s, hip hop was born, right? These huge, revolutionary genres that became massively popular and changed the music scene and changed the way we hear the world. Now what do we have? What's the new musical innovation now of the last 10 or 20 years? I can't think of anything. I mean, that's actually positive.
This is going to be horribly racist, and I don't mean this derogatorily, but do you think that, or not derogatorily, but like, do you think that this is a trade-off of black culture being assimilated into the American like standard culture? I mean, my very favorite chapter in Renegade history was the one where you contrasted Martin Luther King with like this pimp preacher who was also a civil rights leader, but was a very renegade civil rights leader. I can't remember the guy's name.
Prophet Jones.
But like, he had all kinds of women, big cars, dressed like a pimp. But wasn't he a minister too, though?
Well, there was two of them.
No?
There was Sweet Daddy Grace was heterosexual, and then there was Prophet Jones, who was very gay. But they both had huge empires. They were much more famous than King was in the early 50s. And yeah, they had fancy cars. They had white chauffeurs. They had lots of men or women. They had huge mansions. They sat on thrones that were encrusted in jewels. They wore mink coats, the whole 9 yards. They were amazing. And King and the civil rights leadership in the 50s came along and said, "We can't do this anymore. This is non-respectable. This will." Yeah. White people will not allow us to be citizens. They will not respect us. We must change our act. We must clean up our business, and that's what they did. So they basically discredited those guys and tossed them out of the public sphere. And then King and his business suits and all of his other civil rights leaders who were super respectable and good Christians and good Americans replaced them as the leading black people in this country, right? The leading blacks.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think so there's that. There's those guys. Martin Luther King obviously won that pseudo conflict. The mainstreaming of queer culture means that, queer people are not the counterculture, so they're not shaping the future of culture. Jewish people also who have historically been the part of the counterculture and shaping of the future of culture. Do you think that the mainstreaming of these sort of subcultures have contributed to this sort of lack of cultural progression?
I've been thinking about this. So black culture, anybody who knows me knows that my entire life I've been a huge admirer of black culture since I was a kid, until now, like until recent years. There's very little coming out of black culture that I like. We talked about hip hop, R&B has been similar. Like all the songs sound the same. There's hardly anybody who can really sing anymore. Black sort of, cinema has been totally taken over and co-opted by Hollywood, right? By like jamming every black face they can into every movie they make, every TV show, which just sort of dilutes the whole thing. All black culture must be political in a particular BLM woke way, which also makes for shitty art, with a few exceptions. So it's a really grim time for what's called the culture, right? And I is this because of the assimilation of the culture into the mainstream? No, I actually think, and this is going to be controversial for some, I actually think the culture of poverty thesis that was made by a lot of conservatives in their explanation of poverty, in that the culture is what made black people poor more than any structural impediments. I think there's a lot to that. I think there's a whole lot to that. It's very clear that street culture, and I'm talking about working class and poor black people. I'm not talking about middle class and upper class black people who live in, I'm talking about people who live in Compton. Look at what they say in their art. It is nihilistic. It is, it is all about violence and sex and drugs and being a very bad person, being a very, very bad person. So that it's true, that sort of gangster mythological lifestyle is what is still valorized. Well, if you valorize that lifestyle and you really do it in your real life, you're obviously going to go nowhere except maybe to prison or to a cemetery. And it certainly is not going to produce anything of value in your community. So, I mean, this is a strange thing for Thad Russell to be saying, but I think the culture of poverty is a real thing. And not to mention sort of what John McWhorter talks about a lot, which is that there is sort of a prejudice against successful black people, and there is especially a prejudice against black people who get educated in white institutions, which might be somewhat justified, but so it's like there is this culture, and there's sort of this honor of the hood, the honor culture in the hood, where you don't leave the hood or you come back to the hood. It's like, no, fuck the hood, get the fuck out as soon as you can, which is what intelligent people do. So I think that culture of poverty has just made the mass of African Americans in this country poor. And they've remained poor for centuries now. And I think it's just that exhausts the culture. When you're poor, it's really hard to produce good stuff. And I guess, I don't know. I think that culture of poverty is sort of like imploding in on itself. It's just become so awful and nihilistic. It's not adding up to anything. I don't know. There's other reasons for it, but I do think the culture of poverty is a big part of it.
Damn. Well, that's a black pill.
So to speak.
How do cultures change? I mean, we've kind of talked about it, but like, what's the solution for black people? A white savior? I mean, like, I don't want to make this really about race, but I mean, if you have ideas, maybe someone will hear it.
Yeah, well, black people should listen to what I say and do what I tell them. That's the main lesson we want to take from here.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of one of your theses. That's one of your theses too, is that the counterculture has trade-offs. Like, I mean, there's if you're going to be countercultural, then you're not going to be rich most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Unless, of course, you make it as an artist or an athlete or whatever.
Yeah. Right. How do we change culture? We just do what we're doing. What you and I are doing right now is an attempt to change the culture, right? Every podcast, every piece of writing, every tweet is intended to change the culture. And so you just keep doing that until something catches on, or you find allies who think similarly about you, and you can join together and consolidate your forces and amplify your voice and change the culture even more readily. And there's no other way, and there's no explanation for it because it's alchemy. It's magic. We don't know. We can't explain it. Why culture changes. Why do people change their minds suddenly and everybody wants a smartphone in their pocket? Like, was that predetermined? I don't know. Why did it happen when it happened? Is it because Steve Jobs invented this thing, or is it because people wanted that thing? I think it's because people wanted that thing in their pocket. So we just do it. You just do what you're doing, and there's nothing else you can do. I mean, if we could predict what changes culture, right, that would make for a very different world. If we knew what changed culture, right, we'd all be doing it.
Do you think that if so you mentioned earlier that Trump and Bernie Sanders are sort of the renegade culture shaping politicians. Do you think that Trump was in the right place at the right time? Or like if say Ron Paul had run for president in 2016 and not 2012, do you think that he would have been as successful as Trump, or did Trump have some other secret sauce that Ron Paul lacked?
The reason that Donald Trump won is because he was a TV star. Plain and simple. People have grossly underestimated that. He was a TV star. That means he was known and popular among most American people. The elites who run the country, the ruling class, they don't watch TV. So they were unaware of this. This is why Donald Trump was name-checked in hundreds of rap songs before he was president. He was a heroic figure among working-class black people, among people who listen to hip-hop. He was celebrated in those rap songs. He wasn't made fun of. And same is true for like working class white people. People watched The Apprentice. It wasn't at the top show for years and years and years. So we're talking about tens of millions of people who knew him and liked him. And I know for sure that's where he got most of his votes from. And that's why he would have beaten Ron Paul. Ron Paul developed a huge social movement that voted for him, but it was never big enough to get the majority of American people. The only way to get the majority of American people to do anything is to get yourself on TV. Until now. I mean, now it's changing, but television until very recently, television is what made things go. If you could control television or be a presence on television, then you could win the presidency. But Ron Paul never had that. He was never a pop star. He was always so earnest and so policy driven, and no personality was shown. And so just the power of his ideas turned on maybe 10% of the electorate, which is an amazing phenomenon, amazing feat. But you got to have that extra juice in pop culture to really get over. Obama was that way too. I mean, Obama won because he was pop culture friendly in a bunch of ways. Yeah.
Do you think, he's going to be running as a libertarian, but do you think Dave Smith could make a dent, not win the presidency as a third party candidate, but I mean, given his media savviness, his frequent appearances on TV and also on shows like Joe Rogan and Tim Pool, do you think that he would do well?
Dave is going to wreck shit. Dave is going to fuck some people up. It's going to be amazing. Dave is going to make a major dent. Multiple dents. Because Dave is Ron Paul on steroids. Dave is Ron Paul, but with a personality. He's funny. He's young. He's hip. He's media savvy. Very media savvy. And he's a brilliant orator, brilliant debater. He's as good as Ron Paul in those ways, but he has all these other qualities. And he's a really good guy, too. He's actually a good person. So I think...
like the American Zelensky.
I would be shocked if he doesn't break the record for libertarian votes in 2024. I think that's a shoo-in. So we're talking, Gary Johnson got like 1 million or something like that. I think Dave's going to break that by far. I think he might get 2 million. And if you get 2 million, then you're really a serious force in this country. If you get 2 million people to vote for you, which is super possible... especially if he's going against, Trump and Kamala Harris or whatever it is. I mean, good Lord, I could see a lot of people voting for Dave, but it doesn't matter how many people vote for him. He's going to be doing a media blitz like no one's ever seen. And a lot of these ideas will get into the heads of people who have never heard them before. People who were unaffected by the Ron Paul revolution will definitely be affected by the Dave Smith revolution.
That's the most convincing. I'm wearing my Dave Smith T-shirt.
There you go.
I didn't think we were going to be talking about him. So like, it's just weird. I didn't wear the T-shirt on purpose or anything like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the most convincing argument in favor of supporting Dave that I've heard for libertarian. I don't know how into libertarian internal conflicts you are, but like there's this big. I mean, the biggest conflict in libertarianism right now is between the like the paleo strategy where we need to join the Republicans because we're at an existential crisis right now, and the LP is not going to win power, and so we need to abandon it and just join forces with our natural allies on one hand, and then there's the like we're an ideological movement. We can't compromise on that ideology, the principles, which I don't really like the principles talk so much, but I mean, it is a philosophy that happens to also have a political party, which was probably a mistake in the first place. But yeah, I mean, what you just said, that makes me optimistic for sort of the direction that I'm going now. Cause I've kind of decided that the LP is where my friends are, and, hopefully I'm not just spinning my tires by sort of hanging out with them. Although, when I did rejoin the LP, you yelled at me, so I think you jokingly told me I was fired.
Yeah, the Libertarian Party, I don't really care one way or the other about it. I don't think it's a great way to spend your time if you want to change the world. Although if you're Dave Smith and the Mises Caucus and you could take over that party, that seems like it's worth doing because it gives you a bigger platform. And it gives you a vehicle to get your message out. But party politics in general, electoral politics, no, that's not where an anarchist should be. Hello, that seems obvious to me. Yeah. An anarchist needs to be outside the system.
Yeah, okay. So that's your agorist sort of sympathies coming through as well. Do you describe yourself as an agorist at this point?
I mean, I'm pro-agorist. I don't really do anything that's agorism, but I'm certainly pro-agorist. Yes. I believe in counter institutions, counter economics, people making their own stuff, selling their own stuff in their own ways, outside of the purview of governments and corporations, for sure. I mean, that's the way of the future. That's what's happening without us even saying anything about it. Cryptocurrency is going to be the golden road to that future where we all do our own thing economically. We're independent and autonomous economically, which is a beautiful, beautiful idea. I mean, when that comes about, that's the real revolution. When everybody is autonomous economically, that is the real revolution.
There's a lot of people who worry that cryptocurrency is a Trojan horse and that Satoshi Nakamoto, who's, remains anonymous, there's theories as to who he might be, or they, but a lot of sort of the conspiracy theorists especially think that it's actually cryptocurrencies were developed by governments in order to create something that's trackable, traceable, censorable, and also not subject to inflation like their sort of currencies that were in place and seem to be getting the job done up until recently. Smart enough?
The CIA is definitely not smart enough for that. No, I mean, come on, look at the establishment, the ruling class, the political class, whatever you want to call it. And the heads of these agencies, and who would do that? Nah. Tell me who you have seen on Capitol Hill who is intelligent enough to pull that off, to invent cryptocurrency as a preemptive means of social control. Like that's some 5D chess right there. And I don't see anybody in government who has that ability.
It's certainly not the politicians, but the deep state. I mean, they've got experts, right?
So if you're a really smart tech guy or a really smart anything guy, are you going to go into politics, or are you going to go into tech?
No, I'm not going to. Well, I'm certainly not going to go into bureaucracy. If I'm going to go into politics, it will have some reason behind it.
Where's the money? I mean, you can make 10 times more money staying in the private sector. So that's why we get such mediocrities in government. That's exactly why. It doesn't pay as well. It doesn't pay as well.
Man,
so
the only people who do directions.
The only people who do government.
The only people that do it. Go ahead.
Are true believers, right? So you get the worst of the worst. You get people who are mediocre intellectually, and they're religious zealots who want to control us. That's who you get in politics. The worst people. They're all Kamala Harris. They're all some version of Kamala Harris. Some untalented control freak. That's exactly what they all are, of course.
Mm. So Andrew, my partner, my long-suffering partner, who you know and love, he was making fun of me for the podcasts I listened to, and you just listen to conspiracy theorists or whatever. And I was like, hey, Thad's not a conspiracy theorist. And he goes, yeah, ask Thad what he thinks about the moon landing. We're sitting at dinner, like this was dinner conversation. So from the table, I text you, hey, what do you think of the moon landing? And your response, and I quote, was, everybody knows the moon landing was staged. Which, as usual, I was proven wrong in an argument with Andrew because he's right about everything and I'm wrong about everything.
I was mostly joking.
What did you mean by that? Okay, good.
I was mostly joking.
But what?
My feeling on my feeling on the moon landing is very similar to my feeling on 9/11. So I have not seen evidence in either case to suggest that the basic narrative about what happened and why it happened is false. So far, I have not seen any evidence to disprove what I believe was an act of aggression by those 19 militants working for Al-Qaeda with the help of the Saudi government. Right. That's who was behind it. That's who did it. That's who pulled it off. I have not seen any evidence really that's compelling me to believe that the U.S. government had anything to do with it. The same goes with the moon landing. I simply have seen no evidence to suggest that it was faked. Okay, here's the interesting thing, though. That's not interesting. The interesting thing is the politics of those moments, of those events. The politics, the context of those events. What was going on in politics at the time those things happened? At the time of the moon landing and the time of 9/11. What was happening in both cases... Everything's foreign policy, James. Everything is always foreign policy. At the time of the moon landing, the United States was high Cold War, right? This was like peak Cold War. They're competing with the Soviets. And everyone knows that the moon landing was John F. Kennedy's attempt to upstage the Ruskies, the Soviets, who had put a man in space before the United States did, Yuri Gagarin, I think he died recently. The Soviets were kind of like, they were competing pretty readily with the United States in the space race. And the moon landing, it bore no scientific fruit whatsoever. We got almost nothing out of that, except I think Tang, this shitty breakfast drink. But it was a way to put literally the flag on the moon, the American flag in space, to establish that this is us and we conquered it first against the Soviet Union, to show that the U.S. was more powerful, more advanced, more progressive, smarter, right, more capable than the Soviets. It was all part of that Soviet-U.S. rivalry and competition back in the 1960s and 70s. The 9/11, what was happening in the world before 9/11? Well, the neocons and their allies like Joe Biden were trying to figure out how to maintain the United States as the hegemonic power after the Cold War. What do we do now that we no longer have this boogeyman to justify our massive military and all those bases around the world? And as everyone most people know, neocons wrote this little document, the Rebuilding America's Defenses Project for a New American Century, in which they called for they said that they wanted a new Pearl Harbor to justify massive military spending. So in both cases, the moon landing and 9/11 were the best possible things to happen to the foreign policy establishment. In both cases, the politics of it were fantastic for the foreign policy establishment, for the Bush administration, for the neocons, for the establishment generally, who wanted the United States to maintain its hegemony globally. So if they didn't do it, they caught a break with those things happening. If they did do it, I understand why. I just haven't seen the evidence for them doing it, for faking the moon landing or staging 9/11.
I think so. For the record, this is my feeling on the moon landing. I think that the moon landing happened, but I don't think that they live streamed it. I have a feeling that the soundstage thing was like pre-recorded and then I don't know that the technology existed back then. I mean, cameras were massive. They didn't have the satellite link ups and that kind of thing. So that's my feeling. I don't want to get too deep into it, because you just mentioned Pearl Harbor, which brings me to kind of closing out the show, I guess. I'd love to get some insider info on your forthcoming book that's been forthcoming for a few years now. But it sounds like you're putting the finishing touches on it.
Yeah. I got about a few months ago, I was telling people I have 20 pages to write. I still have 20 pages to write because the last few months have been very busy for me, dealing with Renegade University and separating all that stuff. But yes, I'm back at it, and I'm finishing the book with the rise of China and the rise of Trump. So it's a history of it's a history of America in the world. And it's both about American foreign policy, and it's about American popular culture in other countries all over the world, which has been extremely influential in many mostly good ways across the world since the turn of the 20th century. So yeah, it's two major theses. One is that American military interventions has always ended up being bad for American people, blowback. And the other part is that American popular culture, conversely, has always been good for the American people, but also good for people across the world who wanted to live more freely. Because jazz and rock and roll and blue jeans and tattoos and all the rest of it has meant individual freedom for people in places like communist China and Muslim Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So I trace the history of all those countries' experiences with American pop culture, and I show that in all those countries, there were huge portions of the civilian population who just loved Louis Armstrong or loved Elvis Presley or loved James Dean much more than they did the commissars and the heads of state in those countries. And they loved American culture and rock and roll and freedom much more than they did communism, fascism, and Islamism.
That's pretty great.
Yeah.
So I can't read it. I can't wait to read it.
Me too.
Where can people get your take on World War II?
Oh, well, I have a course coming up. World War II, The Great Blowback. Go to
Really?
patreon.com/unregistered. I'll be teaching that in June. 4 parts. I've taught it before. This is like my core course right now. People love it. It is a complete, let's talk about revisionist history. This is a complete revision of World War II history, in which I present the argument, which has been made by several scholars by now in Europe, not so much in the United States, the argument that U.S. participation in the war caused most of the deaths of the war and guaranteed the realization of the Holocaust. Didn't cause the Holocaust, but it guaranteed that the Holocaust would happen. And that's a very complicated argument I will lay out in the course and in my book.
There's a pretty truncated version of it on, I think it was Isaac Morehouse's show, right?
Yeah, Isaac's show. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna link to. I've listened to that episode probably 4 or 5 times.
Wow.
I'm gonna link to that.
Okay.
Because it's a really good preview, and I think it'll sell your course too, which is beneficial for you, but it's also beneficial to the people who are going to be buying it, because it's a really interesting thesis. That you said that it's becoming more and more mainstream, at least in Europe, right?
Yeah. That's where I got a lot of my information, was from historians in especially Germany and Britain, who have been writing this revisionist history of World War II for about 2 decades now. We got access to the secrets to the Gestapo's archives in the 1990s. Those archives were opened up, and so we learned a whole lot about what the Gestapo was doing, the Nazi leadership was doing. And we found out that what some people had suspected but didn't know until then was that the final solution, the genocide of Jews, was not what Hitler wanted at all until the United States entered the war. He did not want to kill the Jews at all. He wanted to hold them as hostages to get what he wanted, which was control of Poland and Western Russia. He did not want to kill the Jews until he was forced to, when the United States intervened, and he knew that he was going to lose the war, and he knew he was going to die. So then that's when he finally gave up and started to exterminate them. But he had been warning the West for years and years and years, for almost 10 years, well, 6 years. He had been warning the West, if you intervene against us in our campaigns in Poland and Russia, we will kill them. We won't kill, but we will give them to you right now if you want. He offered to send the Jews in Germany to America, Britain, France, anybody would have them. Over and over, every year, he said, please
take
them. Please take these Jews that you love so much. And if you don't take them and you intervene against us, we will kill them. And the West kept saying, fuck you, no. And the United States repeatedly refused to take any Jewish refugees at all, as did the UK, as did France, as did the entire world. They kept those people trapped in Nazi regime territory. They kept them trapped in the Third Reich under Hitler's thumb. And then when they had no use for them, when the Third Reich had no use for the Jews, when the war was on and they couldn't do anything anymore, that's when they killed them. The very first extermination camp was in Chelmno in Poland. The first Jews who were killed in an extermination camp were killed the day after Pearl Harbor, after the declaration of war. One day after. That's when it began. That's when the Holocaust began. So its connection, the causation, the causal link between U.S. participation, U.S. involvement, U.S. entry, and the Holocaust is right there. It's right there. And it's there's much more to that story, too. And there's tons of evidence to prove this. And several historians in Germany and Britain have made this argument, not just me.
You just said a thing that's going to get taken out of context if it ever, rises to more than a few hundred people listening to this. You said that Hitler was forced to do it by the U.S. entry into it. Maybe a better way to put that was like he felt compelled to, or was ideologically driven to, or something like that. Is that more accurate, do you think?
Well, okay, sure. I mean, he basically, he said to them, if you do this, I will do that, and they did this, and he did that.
Yeah. Okay. I just don't want to get either one of us in trouble with it.
I mean, also, like he knew that he was going to die. I mean, he knew that once the United States was in the war fully, which it was after Pearl Harbor, that he had to die. He was going to die. That was a war to the finish at that point, and there was no way that Germany could win that war. So, he had no reason to keep them alive anymore.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, Thad. Let's start wrapping it up, I guess. First of all, let me just say hi to my mom, who said hi to me in the chat. Also, que onda to Carlos, who we both love, and then Jose Galison. Do you know Jose?
Sure, I was on Jose's show. Love Jose.
Oh, were you? Oh, yeah. Okay, great. So he was there too, and he says hi.
I saw.
And he's pretty great. Another agorist. Okay, cool. Well, I think that's about it. So we're gonna link to your Patreon. Do you want to link to anything else? Twitter? Anything?
Nope. That's it. All right, go to Patreon.
Yep. Everybody join Thad's Patreon. Join Jack's Patreon as well, because we talked about that earlier, and join my whatever it is that people pay for when I ask for money. Thad, thank you so much. It was great catching up with you. It's been a while since we talked. You've been so busy this month that even my texts were going unanswered, and I felt very neglected. So thank you for an hour and a half of your time.
I'm back.
I love you, man. You are my best friend, and I'm happy to have gotten to talk to you. Thanks a lot.
Oh, I love you too, James, so much. Have a good one. Thank you, man.
All right. Bye.
Bye. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.